Welcome back, everybody, and Happy New Year. It is awesome to kick off this year with my guest today on Token Standard Live. I see already through the chat that we've got people tuning in from India, Dubai. Good morning to you. Good afternoon to those on the East Coast of America and in the Caribbean. I see Cayman down there. So, and I'm in Grand Cayman right now, so that's why you see this different background. Welcome, Gerard Dache from Government Blockchain Association. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. And you can hear me okay. I can hear you okay. So I think we're locked and loaded. Now, for those who are new to the podcast or new to the show, and for your edification, Gerard, so that you kind of understand who we're talking to today and how we're going to frame this up, we have three different primary people that listen to this in the audience and that we care about assisting. And we've put a poll up there. So if you don't mind, guys, just play along so we kind of know from a percentage wise who we're speaking to mostly today. You'll see smart money, which is people that are managing funds, trying to figure out where asset allocation capital is moving and flowing in and out of. That individual or group of people is one audience we care about. C-level executives / government officials. These are people in enterprise that are managing large groups of humanity, whether that be employment-based, whether that be multiple regions. They're dealing with multiple governments in this case, multiple regulatory environments. And they're also looking at what forces are out there, both technology-wise or macro, that could disrupt their business model and where they need to re-engineer their business model. And they're trying to get up to speed. So those C-level executive types that are inside of an enterprise that is not your own company or your own startup, that would be you. And then lastly, what we call the hoodies or the developer / founders, those who are seeking to change the world with some new innovation, some new enterprise, and are out there in the early stage doing it. So welcome to the show. That's who we're talking to today. Gerard, where are you? You're in DC, I imagine.
Yep, I hail from Fairfax, Virginia, right outside of Washington.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure to have you, especially given that the government's still shut down, and at least you're showing that entrepreneurship is alive and well, and so we're glad to have you. We're going to dive right in just for everybody's background that may not know you, and just talk a little bit about Government Blockchain Association and kind of its roots. So it started out a little bit over 18 months ago, primarily as a meetup group.
Right, August of 2016. So my son had bought some Bitcoin. He bought for $100. He bought 97 Bitcoins, and when he sold them, yeah, I know, I hate him too, right? But after I know, my kids are all smarter than I am. So on your next podcast, you should interview them, right? But he paid for a car, a motorcycle, his college tuition, and his expenses, and it kind of got my attention. So I started going to these Bitcoin meetups, and I went to one. The Digital Chamber did one, and I thought, wow, this is pretty cool. I volunteered to lead a government thing, and dots never connected, whatever. And so I thought, well, I'll just have a meetup. And so our first meetup was in August of 2016. Promoted it like crazy, right? I knew it would be big. We rented a big room, 500 people, 500 chairs. No, I'm sorry, 100 chairs. 20 minutes after the event, our second guest arrived, right? And somewhat demoralized. I paid $500 for the room, right? So then we started meeting in libraries and stuff like that. By January of 2017, we're getting 30, 40 people. We became an association in March of 2017, launched a website in the summer of 2018, and today we have 15,000 people attending events in 90 cities around the world.
Yeah, and we're looking at that right now as we go into the Vortex screen share here. But the chapters right now are I said 80 countries. I'm not sure if that's accurate or not, but you mentioned something about it. You're over that number now, right? Or at least with cities?
Oh yeah, we're over 90 cities. I'm not sure how many countries because we got a bunch in the U.S. and the rest are scattered throughout. We started in D.C., so people would come to these meetups and they say, hey, I like what you're doing. I'm from Boston. I'm from Atlanta. I'm from New York. Can we duplicate what you're doing here, which is share your slides? So we said sure, because it was really about collaboration and sharing. And at the beginning, I was creating the content because when I figured if somebody's going to take time away from their family, I want to make sure that they're going to have a good experience, right? All the other meetups, people are getting together for a beer, go, yay, blockchain's going to change the world. But I wanted them to actually learn something. So So I would research. I didn't know anything about it. I would just research on my own, Google a bunch of stuff, and create the presentation. But when we started to grow, it was beyond my capacity to serve that many chapters. So we started developing working groups. Today we have about 45 working groups working on all kinds of stuff.
Well, so I'm looking at, and everyone should be seeing this right now. I think what's awesome, and so we met maybe a month ago. It's so hard because like I've been telling people, I've been in technology startups for the last 12 years. I've been an entrepreneur for 19 now, and when you go through these waves, Web 2.0, whatever, you think, oh wow, a month is like 3 months or a year. And in last year, I think anyone that was following this space, whether they were speculating with cryptocurrencies, whether they were building something or just educating themselves on distributed ledger technologies or attending events, a month in this world of quote unquote, this next economy, this token economy or this blockchain based kind of internet feels like a year. So I think it's been a year that we've known each other, which means we probably met about 3 weeks ago. But we met in DC.
Right.
I think we met in DC, and what I resonated with most when I first heard your story and why I wanted to have you on to kick off this new year is the entrepreneurial DNA that you have, and yet you also have a deep background in enterprise and government contract level IT, and so you really kind of understand the needs, the pains, the constraints of these behemoth bureaucratic institutions as it relates to technology improvements and things. And yet you're an entrepreneur by DNA because no one starts a meetup group and gets smacked in the face with failure by only having $250 per acquisition user show up rate, 2 people, and then keeps going. And then less than 18 months later, actually you didn't even launch the website, you said, until like about a year ago. And so in 12 months, now you've got 94 professional chapters, which you'll tell me a little bit about, 1 or 2 people that lead that, just so everyone can kind of understand what's available to them in the markets they care about. And then student chapters, which I think speak for itself. These are ones that are probably led by students, but 94 chapters. And then we're going to talk about working groups, just so we level set everybody. And then what we're really going to move into is the trends you see and the things you see coming and your perspective, because you've got a unique vantage point sitting on top of all these community organizations that are these cross-pollinated groups, and I think you have a unique perspective on where things are, where they may be going, and what's in the way. So 94 chapters, and who leads some of these chapters? We had talked about Puerto Rico as one example because we knew a mutual friend, Giancarlo, down there, who was the former CIO. But tell us a little bit about who leads these and who stepped up to lead, and kind of organically what you've been surprised most by.
Well, let me start with what I was surprised the most by, because that'll lead into who. What I recognized that early on is there was a lot of people who were interested in the space, but there was nowhere for them to go, right? Because there just weren't any projects, right? There were a couple, 1 or 2, but everybody, people were all dressed up and nowhere to go. So what I figured is, let's just kind of create spaces where people can meet and grow and develop and start to find some places for them to go. And the enthusiasm behind the space is just incredible, right? So people started showing up, not just working groups, but not just chapter leads, but working groups. So one of the early guys that was leading a working group was the Assistant Secretary of Transportation. The Assistant Secretary of Transportation for International Affairs. Another guy was the chairman of the. He was the program manager for the Joint Chiefs of Staff for innovation. You mentioned Giancarlo. Giancarlo is a former CIO of Puerto Rico. We've got CIOs from Albuquerque, just incredible people. We've got a guy out in Washington State who is the advisor to the governor on information technology. And
I'm just scrolling through as you're talking. So you've got Smart City, Records Management, Supply Chain, Taxes, Telecom. I mean, these are working groups that you didn't set out to set up. People. I mean, I see down here below we have new ones that are forming now, but I'm assuming this has all been demand generated, correct?
Yeah. I would say initially when we were putting out the schedule of the chapter meet. So initially when we were doing the chapters, I thought, what are the things people are going to want to know about? They're going to want to know about supply chain, identity management, voting, right? So the initial ones really came from a survey of what was really out there, being posted on blogs and stuff like that. And then once we started them, then we created a link at the top of the page where people could suggest a working group. And if they suggested it, they were on the hook for leading it, right? So we then developed a process to stand up new working groups. And we have a process to stand up new chapters. It's got to be pretty systematized.
Yeah. So I want to touch on the ethics statement, because this was something that resonated between, I think, you and I, and our shared kind of intersects when we first talked. And we'll just come off the screen share and have a conversation about where you see things and where your members are kind of leaning as far as issues and stuff, and let everybody kind of weigh in or ask questions that are relevant to them so we can get them the most value out of their investment of time today. But the ethics statement, this idea that government, needs to be, isn't the solution, as Reagan once said, it's part of the problem. When people see Government Blockchain Association in their name, I'm wondering how they've related to you. Do you get pushback on that? Is it more like a thank God? Because, before they read your ethics statement, which they'd have to go to your website or find and meet you, they may assume that you're on the wrong side of decentralization. But what has your experience been with that? Has it been receptive? I mean, obviously the numbers show for themselves in one regard, but I'm just curious.
Well, how many different people are there, right? We've gotten hate mail that we have the word government in our name, and people misunderstand things about us all the time. When I was down in Puerto Rico, we were speaking literally in the dome of the Capitol. There were about 300 people there. It's an event Giancarlo set up, and we had the president of the Senate there. We had members of the House, business leaders, and they were like, "Oh, thank you! You've got to help us." They're literally begging us to come and help them. So really, we've seen responses all over the map. And to tell you the truth, we have government constituents all over the map, right? Because there are some governments that said, early on, if we find you owning, possessing, selling, or using cryptocurrency in any way, we're going to put you in a forced labor camp, right? Huh. They're one of our constituents, right? Right. Now they have so that particular government, most people may figure out who it is, right? When the U.S. placed economic sanctions on that country, then they turned around and they said, well, this cryptocurrency thing isn't so bad. Maybe let's start experimenting with using it, right? So governments are in many different places. You got places like Wyoming and Ohio and different places like that where they're really all in, internationally, Dubai, and then you've got other places where they want to have nothing to do with it. So it's a very eclectic field. Yeah.
So we'll just kind of end this poll conversation so you know who you're talking to specifically and who we're talking with today. But we've got 43% of people identifying as C-level or executive or government kind of policy advocate, official, something of that nature. And then it was split evenly, 29% smart money, 29% founder/startup. So pretty balanced audience, which by, this is only the 4th episode of Token Standard Live, but I will tell you that that's the most balanced we've had of any concept or content piece. So I think it speaks to the fact that we understand that government, whether in any shape or form or by definition of however it's defined, plays a big role, whether we like it or not, in the future of adoption. And so pretty balanced audience today, which I think is great. Thanks for showing up. So let's dive in and just have a coffee conversation and let everybody in on it around some of the things that you and I were talking about with regards to your ethics statement and kind of some of our core values at World Tokenomic Forum and Token Standard. This notion of inclusion, this notion of diversity and holding the place and space for these healthy debates to occur and to kind of be a steward of the conversations that matter as technology outpaces humans' ability to kind of comprehend it, let alone deal with it. And this ethical conversation that we all need to be having as leaders and what that even means. So I know you've got some thoughts on that. Why don't you vamp a little bit on what drives you and gets you out of bed every morning as it relates to the purpose?
Well, I think that blockchain technology is the most transformative technology in human history. And the reason why I say that is because every other technology kind of builds on each other, right? So like the internet builds on the networks, which build on computers, which build on switches, electricity, all the way back to the wheel and fire, right? However, all of those technologies, what they did is they allowed us to communicate better, right? And with communication came coordination, and with coordination came control. So we started organizing and controlling from tribes to villages to towns to nations to super organizations like Google and the UN, right? And so, while there's been a lot of good in that, there's been a lot of not so good, right? Lord Acton said that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the more we have gravitated towards the centralization of power, right? And listen, I'm in the United States and I'm grateful to be here. I think it's a great country and there's a lot of wonderful people in government and governments around the world that I really think are trying to do the right thing. But it doesn't change the fact that the more power and money concentrates, the more dangerous it becomes, right? This is the very first technology in human history that reverses that trend. It decentralizes power and the opportunity for corruption. And we've never seen anything like that in the history of mankind. And so let me just give you an example. Governments, for example, they monitor, influence, and control what happens in their country through financial institutions, right? So the better we got at communicating and having oversight and all this stuff, now whenever there's a crime, what do they always say? Follow the money. Yep. But when you and I start transacting outside of a financial institution, that means the government loses its ability to see what's happening. And I'm going to assume for a minute that it's all benevolent, right? But sure. When the government loses its ability to see what's happening, it loses its ability to govern. And when a government loses its ability to govern, chaos ensues, right?
Well, I think so I know that we actually see this situation somewhere, but just for the sake of debate, I think that this is part of. There's a couple of semantical things here that we should call out. One, blockchain, which has become the buzzword that everyone loves to hate, right? And primarily because it's only inclusive of one specific type of distributed ledger technology. And yet it also encompasses all when you think about it in the mainstream or the way that most people relate to it, right? Like when you say blockchain, people think they know what it is. The reality is they probably don't. But it gives us something to talk about, right? Just like innovation gives us something to talk about, even though we may relate to that differently. Right. So it's a nothing word, today, and yet it's an everything word all at the same time. So I know in the comments, we've got some people clarifying that, and we would agree with them. We understand distributed ledger technologies is actually what we're really talking about. Blockchain is one of those. It is the one that perversely kind of became the most talked about. You put it in your name, which we don't have to talk about now because I think it's off topic, but it's an interesting thing of how sustainable is that for you over time, and have you thought about that as the industry evolves, right? But back to the main thing, government. Government's another term that. Hey,
Chris, before you go off that point, I want to address something about DLT and blockchain, because I think this is a really important point, and many people miss it, right? We've had DLT for years. There's nothing new about DLT. I don't think that DLT is the transformative technology. I really believe that blockchain is a transformative technology. Now, it is so transformative, it's really hard to jump that chasm, and everybody does. Everybody wants to. So what you'll see in the government and a lot of businesses, right, just like during the internet boom, anything with .com, right, there was this enthusiasm about it. We're seeing the same thing with blockchain. What a lot of people are doing is they're basically doing a DLT project and calling it blockchain because of the hype, right? But DLT and blockchain are very different, right? Blockchain is a type of DLT. Right, but blockchain has characteristics about it that are above and beyond a DLT. We've had DLT for many years, and DLT. I think that the two terms people get mixed up is the difference between distributed and decentralized. So if you have a distributed, database, and there's an admin that can make a change to it, it is not a blockchain. It is it's basically a database that replicates on different places, right? What makes blockchain so transformative, right, is the fact that you don't have a single entity in charge or in control. You have relinquished that central control That's why it's decentralized. And again, most people don't understand the nuance. I think that nuance is critically important.
So it's an important nuance, and I think that it is the nuance, right? Which is this notion of it's a tamper-evident storage medium with a consensus mechanism, and the consensus mechanism is what makes it transformative. Now, there's all kinds of consensus mechanisms, whether they be proof of work, proof of stake, proof of importance, gossip protocol like Hashgraph. So without nerding out and getting in the weeds on that, those are some of the things people that are confused or want to learn more would want to understand. But the idea is when you speak and when you're talking about blockchain in your world, how you're relating to it as a decentralized consensus mechanism driven storage medium, right? I mean, you're basically
correct.
That's what you think is transformative. Now let's talk about government, because government again.
And not even so much a storage mechanism, because to tell you the truth, the blockchains are not really good for storage. It is a ledger, right? I don't walk away from the fact that it's a distributed ledger. It's a ledger that demonstrates proof of ownership, right? Which is a very important ingredient, right? It's not just a DLT. The other things you talked about are part of what really make the whole package important.
Yeah. So just again, for semantics, government is a noun, right? Which is the system by which communities or organizations or nation states, govern themselves. It's also a verb. It's a function. It's, like we basically government for the people, by the people, of the people means that we are the government as individuals. Now, apathetically, we may have, over time eroded our ability to actually impact that, but we can still organize. We can still riot. We can still have things like Arab Spring and in other parts of the world. And, but most people, when they think of government now, they see, politicians, big business, corporate interests, and they see, buildings that are hundreds or thousands of years old, where people that power hungry people go to control the masses. And that is not necessarily in service. Now, we could argue that everyone there's no such thing as all good, all bad, but the reality is governments in general have over time become more and more centralized and more control. And we use these things like, the need to know exactly where the money went. And we do that in the mainstream media because it does the things that it, needs, mass control, things like that. The reality is that innovation has always started in the nefarious businesses, right? Like the reason why innovation occurs is because the people that want to do something outside the current system can't. And so they invent a new way. And whether that's a way to talk to each other that's off the system that exists at that time, which you mentioned telegrams and things like that back in the day, or whether that's a financial way to transact using a new form of currency or whatever. Throughout history, it's always been the outliers that have created the innovation, and that does not make the innovation inherently evil, right? It just means that there was a need that wasn't being met by the current system, and so a new system was invented. And then over time, things like the internet became mainstream because they brought an inherent utility. But inside of that inherent utility are all the unintended consequences it also brought. And so what we're really looking at now, and this is my opinion, you don't have to agree with it, but I think what we're looking at now is we're looking at this world that we live in now, this 30-year-old kind of fully connected world that is rapidly expanding, is better in some ways, but it's also created a lot of unintended consequences that governments are still trying to get their heads and hands around, and it's also empowered them to collapse more control through fear, through other things than they maybe had before, privacy going away, things like that. And now this is threatening to change that again. And so there's this natural kind of push-pull, right, between these constituents. And I don't know if you have thoughts about that, but again, it goes back to what are the ethics by which we are making these decisions, right? What is the guiding principles that we look to as we navigate this?
Well, that's the very first question we asked, and that's why the first thing that we ever created was the ethics statement, right? Because we had to, and I don't know if people had a chance to read it.
I'll pull back up while you're talking.
Yeah, we had to make sure we understood what this was about, right? Was this a tool for the government to exert more? We said, listen, there is an appropriate place for, right? So maybe exercise governance, right? But that doesn't outweigh the will of people, right? That doesn't that way that the 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 needs of the people. So we are very much strict. We recognize that government and that it's, but it's not sovereign, right? So that the government should be sovereign. The people should be sovereign over the government. Now, you said something that was interesting about the nefarious nature of innovation. And what's really funny is, Al Qaeda and the terrorists, they're the ones that really proved that Bitcoin was viable, right? Because let's face it, they couldn't have moved millions of dollars, through the banks and gone to insurance companies and had their transactions insured when they started doing stuff on Bitcoin. They basically proved that it was safe. So it's interesting from that perspective. And the other thing that you talk about is how things change over time. When the telephone was first invented, one of the biggest criticisms is everybody's going to start lying to each other, right? So we wouldn't be able to trust each other. And even with cryptocurrencies, initially we saw a lot of bad actors using it, but now because of analytic tools that we have, and there's a company out of Canada called the Blockchain Intelligence Group. They help law enforcement basically use data analytics and AI to monitor things that are happening on the blockchain to deal with KYC and AML. It turns out that the Bitcoin blockchain, as an example, has a lot of safeguards against bad actors doing bad things. They're actually using the Bitcoin blockchain to stop human traffickers and drug smuggling and all kinds of stuff, because there are now so many connection points, and since it's a permanent record of those transactions, it's now much easier for them to use that network to find criminals than it would be if they're using cash. So a lot of the criminals are going back to cash because it's more secure, more private than the Bitcoin network. So yeah, there is definitely this ebb and flow as technologies move.
What do you think? So what do you think, just high level, what do you think government's role in the future should be personally, as it relates to a decentralized world? Like, assume that land and title, assume that each of us owns our identity, which we haven't owned forever, and certainly own much less of today than we did prior to 2004. And the advent of social media and big behemoths like Facebook and Amazon and Google kind of oligarching our data. So what does a world where you have decentralized everything, and whether that takes us 10, 50 years, whatever it gets to, what are the role of governments in that world from your perspective today?
Look, that's a great question. Somebody said to me one time, do you mean to say, Gerard, that we don't have all the answers? And I said, Jiminy Crickets, we don't even know what the questions are, right? Because if you think about when the internet first came on board, very smart people said, hey, you know what we can do with this technology? We can do file transfers. So I don't have to physically take that media and drive across town. I can just transfer it from my computer to yours, right? That was this huge innovation. They never imagined.
Some of my older friends call that sneakernet back in the day, right? You had to sneak it. Oh, you had to put sneakers on and run it over to the other disk drive.
Now, those are the same people at that time that told their kids, don't talk to strangers, don't get into a stranger's car, and for whatever, don't spend the night in somebody's house that I don't know who they are. Now we're telling our kids, yeah, go ahead and go online, book your travel, take an Uber to somebody's house, right, and then spend the night somewhere to Airbnb. Right?
I'm in an Airbnb right now.
Yeah, you can swipe right or left and figure out who you're going to date that night, right?
Yeah, right.
So we had no idea when the internet first came out, right, all of those different applications. And that's kind of how it is with blockchain. Nobody really knows all of the things that this is going to impact. But here's what I do know. I think that the whole concept of banking, central banks, right? I don't see central banks in the future, right? What's happening in the banking industry, as an example, is retail banks are really realizing that they can do cross-border payments, using R3 or Chase, and there's different consortiums building where they're using blockchain for cross-border payments. The old system is they would go through the central banks. It would take days and all kinds of costs. They're now doing it in seconds without the transaction fees, right? So now the central banks, they're realizing that they're competing now with the retail banks, so they're actually doing direct to consumer accounts, and at the same time they're trying to develop their own national cryptocurrencies because they see this stuff is coming, and they're trying to find their place. I think at the end of the day, they're not there, which means if they're not there, we need new mechanisms and structures for governing economies. Those are probably coming at some kind of algorithm based.
I would argue before we even get there, we need a massive, which we may or may not get, but we need a massive awareness uptick of that. The last 100 years, which 105 years ago is when the Federal Reserve Act was passed, right? And then you can look at these different stages, 1933 and 1971 and these other things. But, we've only had the current system for the last 105 years. Prior to that, we had, several other attempts at central banks. It always ended badly. Every president in America that killed the bank either got shot at or died because of an assassination. And again, not speaking to anything other than data and facts. I'm not calling out conspiracy theorists or putting on a tinfoil hat. I'm saying that when you have these major shifts where power centers move, you will also have major attempts to retain or to get in front and end run where that shift is occurring. And I think we're sitting in one now. And I believe that I don't know if you're right on that. I believe that would be a really wonderful end game for humanity. I also don't know how likely that is because, again, I don't know. I know that the questions we need to ask are the key thing, and some of those are simple things like, why does a central bank exist? What does it mean to be a lender of last resort? Because if we can ask those simple questions that are answerable even on their own websites, then humanity can start to, at a larger level, understand why the current system is in place, and then decide whether or not they think it's fiduciary or if it's the right system moving forward. But until we have that, it's too easy for Chairman Powell and for Trump to blame this and for the Democrats to blame that and for the economy to crash and then for the bankers to, like they always have done, come in and save the day with, they're more of the same solution packaged up in a new diaper, right? And I call it a diaper because it's poop, right? It's contained. Not good.
You talk about something that's really critical, right? And I refer to it as paradigm, right? I remember when I first started talking about some of this stuff with people, their first reaction was anger, right? Because the whole concept of money and value is so central to our everyday lives that when we threaten that understanding, it just causes this kind of reaction. And people cannot imagine or see a world where the dollar isn't the reserve currency, or the banking system doesn't work the way it is. And it's their paradigm, right? They believe that it's always been that way, it always will be that way. And these paradigms are so powerful, and they're more powerful than facts. And let me give you an example. When the Titanic was sinking, right? Well, let me back up. When the Titanic was launched, right, it was billed as the unsinkable ship, right? The headlines, I think it was the New York Times. The headline that day was, God himself couldn't sink the Titanic, right? Now, that's not the threat that I would make, right? But people would just believe it was unsinkable. So when the Titanic was actually sinking, the SS California was within sight of it. It physically saw the tail end of the ship go up into the air and then go into the water. And they didn't do anything because they said, it must be an optical illusion. That ship can't sink. Right. And they could have saved all those people on board. But their paradigm was so powerful that they didn't believe their own eyes. Right. And that's how this is one of the reasons why we're doing what we're doing with education and awareness, is because we're trying to get people to think, right? Look, if you've ever looked at the U.S. debt clock, right? I don't know if you can pull it up,
I'll
right?
Pull it up.
U.S. debt clock.
Give me a second. I'll pull it up.
You've seen it before, right?
Oh, yeah.
So here's what's happening.
I think we crossed 22
Here's what's
trades.
happening.
We'll find out in a second.
Right. So our political system and the way that most democracies work around the world is you don't get reelected if you raise taxes or reduce spending. Period, end of story. Doesn't matter what your political party is. That's just the system, right? You can't. and you have to spend all the money that you have or you'll in the next budget cycle. So what ends up happening is we spend more than we bring in. And whenever we do that, the only way around that is to create more supply. So they do that through fractional reserve lending, right? Well, when we do that, we devalue the currency. So to maintain the same level of spending, we now have to create more supply, which devalues the currency, which means we have to create more supply, right? And then what ends up happening is the buying power gets less and less and less. That's why we have inflation. Then along comes something like cryptocurrency, right? See, in the past, we never had anywhere else to go, right? If we didn't like our current economic system, unless we picked up our family and moved to another country, we were stuck. But now, with a couple points and clicks, I'm in an entirely new economic system. And so if I don't like the devaluation of my currency, I can just switch. And if you have something like a Shift card or something like that, I use my Shift card at any place that accepts Visa. As we make it easier for people to use cryptocurrencies, right? And as the technology and the phone apps and stuff like that, and the point of sale, as those things increase and more people start to move into that, guess what? In 3 months, now it wasn't at the time of the crash, but the cryptocurrencies generally go up, right? In 3 months, just in using cryptocurrencies at gas stations, 7-Elevens, right, sort of my discretionary spending, I made $10,000 in capital gains because I knew that the dollar was going to consistently devalue, and I knew that the cryptocurrencies would consistently go up in value. Now, again, it's wildly volatile, and those issues need to get worked out. But they will get worked out. The larger the adoption becomes, right, the less volatile it'll become. And as people see that I can get involved in a cryptocurrency that continues to increase my purchasing power, or use fiat currency that decreases systematically, more people are going to move out of it. And as that happens, the demand for the dollar drops, which means you have to create more supply.
And I think this is where government. So this is where government, right, and governments in this race understand that that the U.S. is beyond vulnerable, but that they're kind of codependent. Like everything's codependent, right? China's still codependent on us. We're still codependent on them. But the bottom line is that from your perspective, this interest of blockchain and governments, we'll say those two things, right? Government leaders, people that are trying to figure out how they're going to, protect their country, get their country ahead, or what war is coming, or what they're going to do. This is now, the next Bretton Woods is imminent, right? And everyone kind of understands that if they have enough gold, if they have enough, assets, when that thing goes down, the current system goes down, whatever that looks like. And as Rebecca Costa said, collapse doesn't necessarily imply, and it is scary in one way to think about, but it doesn't necessarily imply like, the end of the world scenarios. It just it implies a reversion to simpler systems. Right, because the complexity of the current system just becomes completely unworkable. And so when we think about just collapse or shifting into a simpler system, countries right now, I would imagine, and a lot of these chapters are trying to figure out what's our opportunity, what's our risk, and how fast can we get our heads around what we can do here, because sovereignty, all these things are in play. But as this new world order, this next world order gets, set up, all of a sudden you'll have virtual. I noticed you didn't have anybody on the map yet in a chapter in New Zealand, but we're one of our portfolio companies is got their foundation based out of New Zealand, and there's some really interesting stuff happening on sovereign land in New Zealand with digital societies. Estonia's got what they've been working on for several years, and 193 different countries visited this showroom in Estonia last year, and we lived there all summer and kind of spent some time in that market. So as these digital societies and these needs for mesh governance, kind of avail themselves, this conversation around the U.S. and our kind of status almost becomes, secondary, right? Like this one's obvious. We just don't know what the replacement is yet.
It's interesting in that sovereignty and borders, especially economic borders, are getting blurrier all the time, right? It used to be that the U.S. could control its economy. It's not so true anymore, right? There's foreign actors that have as much of an impact on the U.S. as well, a lot more than you'd imagine. And so, and not just the U.S. When I was doing business in China, my customers in China would pay me in Bitcoin, and the reason they would pay me is because the Chinese government was concerned about capital flight. So what they would do is they created limits on how much foreign currency people could buy, right? So if people wanted to pay me, they could go to the bank, they could fill out an application. It would sometimes take weeks, and there would be all kinds of transaction fees. When they paid me in Bitcoin, it would generally happen within 10, 20 minutes, and there were relatively no transaction fees at the time. So the governments potentially lose their ability. The whole issue of national sovereignty, it's challenged, right? Listen, again, I've been very involved with governments. I recognize governments have a very legitimate role in our society, but the entire structures, right? The very paradigms about how governments govern, they're being threatened, and that means that we need to find new mechanisms, right? And that's why there's so much opportunity, because I'm not suggesting that everything sort of devolves into chaos. I'm suggesting we need to find bridges to new methods, to new mechanisms, to still accomplish. We still need to protect the environment. We still need to protect people from bad actors, right? We're gonna need to do that. But how we're still gonna have to build infrastructure, right? But how we do that, I think we're gonna need a lot of smart people to figure this stuff out.
Yeah, I think that's a key common takeaway, right? Is that there's a lot of efforts out there. And just like there's a lot of startups out there last year, most of those startups are going to, go by the wayside and need to and should. And hopefully those people that are true entrepreneurs will try again and do something else, or they'll go join the one that won and add value as a number 2 through 100 in their scale up. But the bottom line is there's a lot of people that have tried, especially given all the hype around blockchain, Bitcoin, crypto last year, to organize communities of interest around this important conversation that impacts humanity, not just in any one region, but globally. And I think, you've done a hell of a job for what I can say of demonstrating an ability to execute in organizing that conversation as well, if not better than anybody I've run into. I know you're somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 or 1,600 members that are paying, and there's different ways to pay as an individual, a student, or a corporate. I'm happy that we're now a corporate member, so you've done a great job executing that. What are your needs this year? Like how can I help you, or how can someone out there who wants to participate in this conversation, either by shaping a working group, or putting something out there for debate? I mean, we've had some conversations in this chat while we've been going that, I think are important debates to have. And so how does someone play a role and leverage your platform to both add value to you, but also get involved in 2019?
Well, I'm a capitalist, right? And so I believe things work really well when everybody pursues their own interests, right? So we've created a platform to help people succeed. And if they succeed on that platform, it's good for us. So the best thing people could do, it would be to join us as members. So individual membership's like $199 a year. It may go up in January. Corporate membership, we try to keep everything very inexpensive. So it's $1,500 to $5,000, depending on the size. And then to get in the working groups and to work with other folks in the working groups to create something of value. So, for example, let me say when they do that, then we get to brag about the accomplishments of our members, and it promotes our members, but then it also promotes us. It gives us an opportunity to shine the light on our members and let some of that light spill back on us, which would then allow other people to join us, which then gives us the operating capital we need to maintain the organization. So I'll tell you right now, financially, we're stretched, right? We when I built this thing, I had about a year's worth of runway to build it, and we had to travel all over the world and meet with all kinds of people, and we poured tons of money into the technology, and so if anybody could help us financially, that would be awesome. But the best way to help us financially is to join and then create value, because the value then will attract other people. Let me just give you an example about one or two of our working groups, right? So our healthcare working group, they're creating a global healthcare certification standard, right? Which is just awesome. So we want to get our members to the point where they can essentially do blockchain specific healthcare training, right? And we're also doing blockchain training for the financial services, for legal and law, right? And so our working groups are actually creating that training curriculum to provide certification in all of these different industries, because all of these industries have to grow in different ways, right? Another thing that our healthcare working group is working on is putting blood and organ donations on the blockchain. We're working with a company out of Dubai called donor.org, DHONOR.org. And they anticipate being able to save a lot more lives, because when people are in car accidents, right, there are people that have organs that they've been willing to donate, right, but the connections aren't there. And because of HIPAA and privacy laws and the different technology stacks, those connections can't be made. Blockchain solves a lot of those issues.
Sorry, I pulled up the donor.org site and it started playing music at me, but I wanted to make sure that
that's a great video. Listen, if you put that in your show notes or whatever, I would encourage everybody to watch that video, because it's such a great illustration of how the blockchain can be used in a non-currency capacity to really impact the lives of people, right?
Yeah,
it's a phenomenal.
People listening in from Dubai, so they may know individuals there. So I think as we wrap up, I want to give you a chance to say one more thing or one more takeaway as it relates to transformative leadership or ethics or how to get involved. I love the use case of healthcare and these certifications. I think whenever you grow a company, whether it's a nonprofit association like yours right now or any startup company, you get stretched. And so everyone on this that is in that 30% or even in that investor class that funds that knows that success, causes its own set of problems and pain. And I think your willingness to be transparent about that, I appreciate. Again, radical transparency, being one of our core values at World Tokenomic Forum. I think that's awesome that you just kind of went there with that in a powerful way. For those who can help or want to get involved, what I heard loud and clear was, bring the value that you're trying to create, bring it to our platform. Let's have a discussion where you could almost collaborate with them on other things in network that may be working on similar or related challenges, and become a lever point for them and a platform for them to scale their needs. Because I do know, I've seen Naveen and a couple folks that I happen to know from a company that's Katie, I see you there from Hyperfield, and they're in a solution space that's heavy on DoD, but that goes out into a lot of complex field asset management tools, right? And so some of the problems there may be a working group already in GBA, or maybe there needs to be one around how do we manage complex assets in the field. And governments from not only the U.S., who has the largest military spend of anybody in the world, but other countries that are trying to figure out, how do I keep my readiness there from a defense standpoint when Boeing and Raytheon don't want their bill of materials to be seen by the guy in the field, and you have to always ship it back to HQ. That's inefficient, right? So they're using AI and blockchain and augmented reality to actually create solutions where you can solve massive inefficiencies and reduce the budgets 40% in some cases, which in our case would put $300-400 billion back into the kill. Anyway, interesting ideas, interesting opportunities to get involved with you. Where do they go? They go to gbaglobal.org. Is that the best place?
gbaglobal.org. Let me throw something back in terms of what you just said. My biggest desire, we've got some phenomenal resources in GBA, right? One of the resources, for example, is it's a free development platform. So anybody who wants to develop blockchain applications, right? One of our GBA members has made their development platform available to all GBA members. You don't have to have any technical skills. If you can point and click, you can build a blockchain application, and it's blockchain agnostic, right? We've got folks that are knee deep in the supply chain space, right? That are currently doing supply chain for, I think it's the Army Missile Command, right? So these are top secret supply chains on a blockchain, right? We've got guys that have written cybersecurity, written instructions that basically help a blockchain get through the government's ATO process, right? Authority to operate, right? Unheard of, but groundbreaking stuff. We've got phenomenal resources, right? And I think we're the best kept secret in the world, because if a company is really serious about being in the blockchain space and they plug into a network of what I believe are world-class blockchain game changers, right? And all they got to do is, you and I went through some of the technology on the back end. All they got to do is search, point, click, connect, and we've created a family, right? A culture of people that they just want to work together to implement these solutions. And this thing is so big and so massive, nobody should go it alone, right? Nobody should say, look, we're going to be the solution. You got to create an ecosystem. And
absolutely, ecosystem is
that's exactly what bring their talents and create an ecosystem so that the rising tide can lift all the ships.
Yeah, and we talked a lot about ecosystems and versus economies last episode with Mickey McManus, and who's one of the leading design thinkers. So I think for people that want to understand more about what that means, I'd recommend episode 3 and Mickey McManus's kind of conversation. Gerard, it's been a pleasure. I look forward to our next time that we meet both in person and when we do an update on this, maybe in a future episode. But Happy New Year to you. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, everybody, for sticking around and for the comments. We had a very active thread this time, and we'll wish you all a great kickoff to this new year. And I put in the thread how you can get in touch with Gerard. You can find him on LinkedIn. You can go to gbaglobal.org. And, worst case, you can email me, and we'll connect you. And let's stay in touch, my friend.
All right, you have a great day, my friend. Hey, next time you come to the DC, I give the best nighttime tour of DC on the history of the planet.
Well, I'm definitely calling you up on that one. That sounds good. I'll talk with you soon. Thanks everybody for tuning in. That's another episode. We are out.
All right, bye-bye.